Hode from Handsworth Park Community Garden, working with Sir Hayley and the Active Wellbeing Society and the Friends of Handsworth Park. So today I'm back in the garden. It's been a really lovely spring. We've had all this sunshine, but now we've had a lot of rain, which is fantastic for all of our seedlings and for the soil. But it's also fantastic for all the weeds. So anybody who's growing things at home, you may have noticed that there'll have been a sudden rush of the weeds growing. So what I'm doing today is I'm just weeding out some of the beds in the community garden. So we've been growing broad beans in this bed. You can just see them over my shoulder behind me. They're flowering and they're actually just starting to form their beans now. But around them quite a wide variety of weeds have grown. Now I know quite often people get confused about what actually is a weed. And we talk a lot about the weeds. Some of them, well, a lot of them, are actually beneficial as food or medicine, or for making other preparations, either for our health or for the health of other plants. So weeds can be used to make teas to feed plants, but they can also be used as medicine for us. So what I wanted to do was talk you through some of the different weeds that you're likely to find in your garden. A lot of them you'll recognise, but I think quite often people aren't sure what they should pull out and what they shouldn't. A general rule, a definition people seem to use for a weed is simply a plant where you don't want it to be. So if you want to grow stinging nettles because you're using them to make tea, then is it a weed? Well, it isn't really, is it? Because it's something so useful and beneficial. But in this bed, this is a broad bean bed, so if we had stinging nettles growing here, it will be a bit tricky because they would be competing with our broad beans for moisture, for nutrients from the soil, for space, for light. So we couldn't really have the two of them in the same bed. So the general rule is weeding is really about removing the things that you don't want. So in this bed around the broad beans, there's quite a lot of chickweed that's grown, but also the trees have been dropping their seeds into our beds. So we've got little tiny trees starting to grow up. They're really small at the moment, but if we left those, then we'd be in trouble with trying to grow anything else in the bed. So what I'm doing today is I'm just going round the broad beans, and I'm taking out anything else that's growing around them in the soil, and that will go in the compost heap. So what I'm going to do is compile some pictures of different weeds that you're likely to find and let you know what they are. You'll have annual weeds, which are ones that come up each year from the seeds of the previous year. Generally they don't have too deep roots, but they'll often come up in the same place because they're growing from seeds. And you'll also have perennial weeds, and these ones are a little bit harder to get rid of. This is things like couch grass, which you may have come across, which has very strong sharp roots, and once you've got that it's hard to get rid of. Things like bindweed, all of those have the kind of roots where if a tiny piece of the root is left in the soil, it will sprout back into another plant. So you have to be quite thorough with getting rid of them. So a general rule when you're weeding is to remove the whole plant. If you just snap off the top, you'll be leaving the roots behind. And if what you're dealing with is a perennial weed, that weed won't go away, or it'll just grow back. As soon as a bit of rain and sun comes, it'll be back to the same size it was before. These plants have adapted to be real strong survivors. I mean, you'll see them growing through cracks in the pavement in the most unlikely of places. So they're really well adapted to growing anywhere. So if we're trying to remove them, we need to do a thorough job. We need to remove all of the foliage and the root, and make sure, ideally, we take them out before they've formed any flowers, because those flowers will then turn to seed. So if you are removing dandelions, again, another really good medicine, but if they're in the wrong place, they can be something that takes over. So you really want to catch them before the flowers turn to the seed pods. There's an old saying of 1 year's seeds will give you 7 years weeds, and that's just because of those seeds from the weeds are really good at reproducing and growing again. So you really need to be careful to get them out. So the ideal thing is to use a hoe or a little trowel and just to dig over the soil and completely remove them before they've actually well established. The smaller they are, the easier they are to get out. And if you're going to weed your garden, this is a good time to do it because it's been raining, so the soil is quite soft and damp, so the weeds come out much more easily. When we were in that really hot sunshine, it would have been quite hard to do the weeding then, because the ground had gone very solid and dry. When it's nice and moist like this, you'll find that the weeds come out much more easily. So this is really the time to do it. I think we've got a bit more rain forecast over the next few days. So yeah, choose a day when the soil is nice and damp to go and tackle your weeding. Remove the weeds to the compost, except for those perennial ones that we were talking about, things like couch grass, things like horsetail or mare's tail, as lots of people in Birmingham call it. Those don't need to go on the compost heap. Those should go into a bucket of water if you want to use them. They can make quite a good feed for your plants like that. They'll rot down into the water, and the resulting liquid is actually a really good feed for plants. But if you put them in your compost heap, then they'll just reproduce in there. As I said, they're just so strong. So I'm going to carry on weeding, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some photographs of the different weeds you're likely to find, and with the uses for them, but also how to remove them. I hope that's been helpful. Goodbye.